catastrophe resulting from the vicious reaction to the rebellion. Okay. Then comes the question, should the U.S., Britain, and France implement it? Well, just take a look at public opinion in the Arab world. It's pretty much the same in Africa. It's well known, doesn't get reported, but it's well known. So, for example, in Egypt, about 90% of the population think that the United States is the worst threat to their interests. I don't know if the question's been asked about Britain, but I bet it would come out the same way. France, I'm sure it would come out the same way. They don't regard in the Arab world, they don't regard Iran as a threat. In fact, about 10% of the population think that Iran is a threat. In fact, opposition to Western policy is so strong that a considerable majority think the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. In Egypt, it's about 80%. This is very significant. These ought to be headlines. This tells you exactly why the West, the United States, Britain, Europe, cannot tolerate democracy in the Arab world. I mean, democracy would mean that these views would enter into policy formation. Britain, the United States, Europe would be out of there. We'd lose the main lever for control of the world. It's not going to happen easily. Well, this relates to whether these countries, the hated countries, and they're hated for good reasons. The West may not like to think about history, but victims have a different view. There's a history, and I don't have to repeat it to you, but there's good reasons why the Western powers are really hated. For Italy is not a major actor in world affairs, but the same is true there. So it turns out the first post-World War genocide, real genocide, was in eastern Libya, the part that's liberated, carried out by the Italians. The Italians don't like to think about it, but you can be sure they remember. So there is this kind of huge burden borne by the Western powers. If they do anything, even if you can imagine there are noble motives behind it, which it's hard to imagine, but even if you imagine that, anything they do is going to have consequences. For example, it could sharply increase humanitarian catastrophes, just because of the whole baggage that's there and the reaction to it. The African Union has been very quiet about this, because from their point of view, part of what's going on is an attack on Africa by the West and indeed by the Arabs. And that evokes all kind of memories of the slave trade and all sorts of other things. So you have to understand what you're getting into if there's military intervention of any kind, even no-fly zone. Well, maybe also there's another question. If there is to be a no-fly zone, why should it be these countries carrying it out? I mean, the most respected country in the region, by far, is Turkey. Turkey's a NATO power with a huge air force. They could carry it out. Egypt, by now, is a respected country in the region after the uprising. They have a pretty substantial military force. They all have the capacity to institute no-fly zone. If they're not doing it, we should ask, why are they not doing it? And should we be doing it when the regional powers don't do it? I should say that Turkey has supported the uprisings. In fact, Prime Minister Erdogan, Turkish Prime Minister, who's far and away the most popular leader in the region, he was also the most outspoken in support of the uprisings. He wasn't Blair or Obama. He came out strongly in support of it. Well, he's not calling for no-fly zone over Libya. Why? I mean, there are regional concerns that we just can't ignore. All of these considerations should come into play in making a decision as to whether to implement a no-fly zone. And exactly what conclusion you draw from them, well, I think but I don't think it's a trivial question, but there's a lot that's being left out of the discussion. And unless it's brought in, it's not a serious discussion.
Well, this has to be the last question. It's a composite question, I suppose, really, and it's a local interest, a British question, really, and it has to do with we've had a couple of questions coming by text, in fact, rather garbled, but the gist of them was: at what point does it become justified, given a really bad government, and in this case a really regressive government, socially and politically, doing all kinds of probably irreparable damage to things like the NHS, higher education, and really wrecking a lot of life? At which point does it become appropriate for people to take a lesson from what's happening in the Middle East? And for people to take a lesson from what's happening now in the Middle East and say this is now too bad to be tolerated, and we have to take some kind of... I mean, there's a big rally in London which will be happening very soon. At what point does it become justified to take what would seem very drastic action in the British context? And the other question, which might bring Jody in again, has to do with freedom of speech. He's been very much on the sharp end of some pretty brutal behaviour aimed against freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and it ties in with that other question. At what point do these things become intolerable?
You've got to decide for yourself. In my view, they become intolerable pretty early on. What's happening the attacks on freedom of speech. I mean, it's now in British law. You know, after 7/7, the terrorist attacks, there was new legislation which makes it a crime to say or publish anything that might provide some support for or encouragement of potential terrorism. Actually, there's a court case coming in England about a bookstore. Talk about bookstore, I think it is, which is where the owner is being charged with carrying material which from jihadi sources. I mean, you know, for serious, that's the kind of material we should be reading. I don't know what they're about. But he's carrying material from jihadi sources, and naturally this material glorifies jihad. It gives reasons why I should do it and so on. So he's being brought to trial, and the case is coming up in a couple of months. Well, these are pretty serious attacks on freedom of speech, and they're showing up in other ways too. Same in the United States, incidentally. Go into it if you like. But at what point do you do something about this? Well, you know, I think it's pretty serious. The social policies being carried out, not for me to decide. I think they're really outrageous. In fact, this is happening all over Europe. This is one case in which I tend to agree with the Obama administration against Europe. Europe is now, Cameron's an extreme case, but all over Europe, the economic policies are to introduce austerity at a time of serious recession. Well, that's crazy. I got a name for that. That's Herbert Hoover. You know, that's the experience with it. That was Herbert Hoover's policy in the late 20s, and it created the Great Depression. Roosevelt came in, and the New Deal kind of reversed it. But then in 1936, under business pressure and similar ideological pressure, Roosevelt went back to a kind of Hooverism, withdrew the stimulus because of the deficit, and sank the country right back into recession. Then got out of it largely through the war. But there's both economic theory and history and just plain common sense that tells you that at a time of limited economic demand, because industry refused to invest, corporations refused to invest, banks don't want to lend, at that kind of time, and when they're in fact giving themselves plenty of bonuses. I mean, read the front pages of the British newspapers every day.